What if one decision, made over 100 years ago, quietly reshaped the world you live in today, and not for the better? What if America joining World War I didn't save civilization, but instead set off a chain reaction of chaos that we're still dealing with right now? This is not the version of history most of us were taught. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. At the True Archive, we look past the heroic headlines and dig into what really happened beneath the surface. In this video, we're going to challenge a powerful myth and uncover how a single intervention changed global politics, American freedom, and the future of war itself. Stay until the end, because the final connection we reveal may completely change how you view modern conflicts today. For most of our lives, we've heard a very clean version of this story. America, we're told, was forced into World War I to defend freedom, protect innocent lives, and stop a dangerous threat to world peace. It sounds noble. It sounds necessary. And on the surface, it sounds convincing. According to this version, the United States had no real choice. Germany was portrayed as reckless and brutal, and American leaders supposedly stepped in as reluctant heroes, doing what had to be done when the world was falling apart. This story has been repeated in classrooms, documentaries, and speeches for generations. But here's the problem. This version leaves out uncomfortable details. It skips motivations, ignores contradictions, and avoids consequences. And once we slow down and examine what really happened, that simple story starts to fall apart very quickly. On paper, the United States claimed it was neutral when World War I broke out in 1914. The government said it wanted peace and distance from Europe's chaos. But in reality, neutrality existed mostly in words, not in actions. Behind the scenes, American factories were working non-stop. Weapons, ammunition, and supplies flowed across the Atlantic to Britain and France. At the same time, powerful banks approved massive loans that kept those countries financially alive. Without that money, the war effort on one side would have slowed or even collapsed. To the average American, this support felt invisible. But to Germany, it was obvious. One side was being fed resources to keep fighting, while the other was being slowly strangled. This wasn't staying out of a war. It was shaping the outcome from afar, long before the first American soldier ever stepped onto a battlefield. While America focused its anger on German actions at sea, something far quieter and far deadlier was already happening. Britain had placed a massive naval blockade around Germany. Ships were stopped. Trade was cut off. Even food meant for civilians was treated as a weapon of war. This blockade didn't just weaken the German military. It slowly starved ordinary people. Families. Children. Elderly civilians who had no control over the war being fought in their name. Hundreds of thousands died from shortages and malnutrition, far away from the trenches. What makes this moment so important is America's response. There was outrage over submarine attacks, but almost silence over a policy that killed civilians just as surely, only more slowly. This double standard would shape everything that came next, and it pushed the world closer to an even greater disaster. As the British blockade tightened, Germany responded the only way it believed it could. Submarines. Small, hidden, and deadly. Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone and warned neutral ships to stay away. It wasn't subtle, but it was survival. Then came the sinking of the Lusitania. Over 1,000 lives were lost, and to the American public, it looked like a ruthless attack on innocent civilians. But what was rarely mentioned was what the ship was carrying beneath its decks: large quantities of ammunition and explosives, sent straight through a declared war zone. That detail mattered. But it was buried. Outrage was amplified, context was removed, and emotion replaced analysis. This single event became the emotional turning point that made war feel inevitable, even though the full truth was far more complicated. As emotions rose, another force was quietly shaping events behind closed doors. Money. By the time the war had dragged on for years, American banks had lent enormous sums to Britain and France. These weren't small risks. If those countries lost the war, much of that money would never come back. This created a dangerous situation. An Entente defeat would not just be a European problem. It would hit Wall Street, American industry, and powerful financial interests at home. Suddenly, neutrality wasn't just about staying out of a foreign war. It became a threat to profits and influence. Framed this way, entering the war began to look less like a moral crusade and more like a financial safeguard. Defending freedom sounded far better than admitting the real fear was losing billions. At the center of this turning point stood President Woodrow Wilson, a man who spoke the language of peace while preparing for war. During his campaign, he promised to keep America out of the conflict. Many voters believed him. But behind the speeches, something very different was happening. Wilson pushed for rapid military expansion and framed the war as a moral duty. He didn't just argue that America needed to defend itself. He claimed America had a responsibility to reshape the world, to stand against governments he labeled as dangerous or undemocratic. This way of thinking was new, and it was powerful. For the first time, war was sold not as survival, but as a mission. And once that door was opened, it would never fully close again. By the time America entered the war, most people believed Germany was solely to blame for everything that had gone wrong. It was portrayed as aggressive, ruthless, and uniquely dangerous. But history is rarely that simple. Before the war began, Europe was a web of rivalries, alliances, and old grudges. France wanted revenge for past humiliation. Russia feared losing influence. Austria-Hungary was struggling to hold itself together. Germany, surrounded on multiple sides, believed it was facing an unavoidable threat. None of this excuses the destruction that followed. But it does matter. Because when one nation is labeled as pure evil, it becomes easier to justify anything done to defeat it. And that mindset would soon have devastating consequences. By the time the United States officially entered the war, Europe was exhausted. Armies were drained. Economies were breaking. On several fronts, the fighting had reached a deadlock that could not last much longer. Peace, while imperfect, was becoming possible. But American money and supplies changed that balance. Loans, food, fuel, and weapons allowed Britain and France to keep fighting when they otherwise could not have. What might have ended sooner instead dragged on, month after month, year after year. This extension came at a terrible cost. Every extra mile gained or lost meant more bodies, more families shattered, and more nations pushed beyond recovery. American intervention didn't just decide who won. It increased how much everyone lost along the way. Everything changed once American soldiers began arriving in Europe. Not just because of their numbers, but because of what they represented. Fresh troops. Fresh supplies. And a signal that time was now on one side only. For German leaders, this was a countdown they could not stop. Knowing millions more American troops were on the way, Germany made a desperate gamble. They launched massive final offensives, hoping to force a decision before the balance became impossible to overcome. These attacks were fierce, costly, and ultimately unsustainable. As American forces continued to pour in, the outcome became clear. The war was no longer about endurance. It was about survival. And at that moment, the fate of Europe was sealed, not by peace talks, but by overwhelming force. With defeat now unavoidable, the old world began to crack apart. Empires that had ruled Europe for centuries collapsed almost overnight. Germany's government fell. Austria-Hungary shattered into smaller states. Long-standing political systems simply disappeared under the pressure of war and defeat. In their place came big promises. Leaders spoke of fairness, self-determination, and a new world built on justice. President Wilson, in particular, promised that nations would finally be allowed to choose their own futures. To exhausted populations, these words sounded like hope. But the reality would be very different. These promises were applied selectively, shaped by power and revenge rather than principle. What followed was not a stable peace, but a fragile illusion, one that would soon collapse under its own contradictions. When the war ended, the victors gathered to decide the future of Europe. Germany was not invited to negotiate. It was told to accept the terms or face renewed war. This was not a peace built on reconciliation. It was a punishment. The treaty stripped Germany of land, population, and resources. Its economy was deliberately weakened, and full blame for the war was placed squarely on its shoulders. The goal was not stability. It was control. Even some of the treaty's own architects warned it would create disaster. Instead of healing Europe, the agreement planted anger and desperation deep into the heart of an entire nation. What followed was predictable. A peace that humiliates rather than rebuilds does not end conflict. It only delays the next one. The end of World War I did not bring real closure. It left wounds open and anger unresolved. Germany was humiliated, economically crushed, and politically destabilized. Millions of people were left searching for someone to blame and someone to follow. That environment is dangerous. As years passed, resentment hardened into rage. Extreme ideas that once seemed unthinkable began to feel justified to people who had lost everything. The world told itself this was a new problem, but it wasn't. It was the delayed explosion of a war that never truly ended. World War II did not come out of nowhere. It grew directly from the choices made in 1918 and 1919. When peace is built on punishment, history has a way of repeating itself, only louder and deadlier the second time. While the war was tearing Europe apart, something quieter was happening inside the United States. Freedom began to shrink. New laws made it illegal to criticize the government, the military, or even the war itself. Speaking out could cost you your job, your reputation, or your freedom. Thousands of Americans were arrested or silenced simply for questioning the decision to fight. Newspapers were censored. Fear replaced debate. This wasn't a country under invasion. It was a country suppressing its own people in the name of unity. The tragedy is that many accepted it as necessary. But once freedoms are taken during a crisis, they rarely return completely. America entered the war claiming to defend democracy abroad, while quietly weakening it at home. Before the war, German culture was woven deeply into American society. German was commonly spoken. Newspapers, schools, and community groups thrived openly. But once the war began, that heritage became a target. Suddenly, being German was seen as suspicious. Schools stopped teaching the language. Families changed their names to avoid harassment. Communities that had existed for generations were pressured to disappear almost overnight. Some German Americans were even detained, not for crimes, but for who they were. This fear-driven backlash erased a vibrant part of American life. It showed how quickly a nation can turn on its own people when panic replaces reason. And it left scars that lasted long after the war itself had ended. America's entry into World War I didn't just change foreign policy. It permanently transformed the country's military and economy. Before the war, the United States relied on a relatively small volunteer force. That changed almost overnight. Conscription was introduced, forcing millions into uniform. Factories were redirected toward weapons and war supplies. Taxes increased to fund a military unlike anything the country had seen before. What began as an emergency response quickly became the new normal. Once this system was built, it never truly disappeared. The war created powerful industries and institutions that depended on conflict to survive. From that point forward, America was no longer a nation that avoided foreign wars. It had become a nation structurally prepared for them. When the guns finally went silent, the damage did not stop. Power shifted away from Europe and toward the United States, not just economically, but politically and militarily. America emerged as a global force, no longer tied to its own continent, but deeply involved in the fate of distant nations. Europe, meanwhile, never fully recovered. Empires faded. Economies weakened. Old rivalries turned into new resentments. And the idea that America should step in, judge, and intervene became normal. What began in 1917 slowly evolved into a permanent mindset. This is why World War I still matters. Many of today's global tensions trace back to that moment. The world we live in now is not an accident. It is the long shadow of a single choice made over a century ago. So after all the promises, all the sacrifices, and all the destruction, one question remains. Was it worth it? Did America's decision to enter World War I truly make the world safer, freer, or more stable? Or did it simply trade one catastrophe for several others that followed? Millions were killed. Entire civilizations were shaken. A second, even more devastating war was set in motion. And at home, freedoms were weakened in ways that still echo today. These outcomes weren't accidents. They were consequences. At the True Archive, we don't ask these questions to provoke guilt or anger. We ask them to understand cause and effect. Because when history is misunderstood, it doesn't stay in the past. It quietly shapes the future, again and again. History isn't just something we study. It's something we argue about, learn from, and pass on. And this story, especially, deserves discussion. If you agree, disagree, or see things differently, share your thoughts in the comments. Thoughtful debate keeps history alive. If this video made you question what you thought you knew, consider sharing it with someone who loves history or cares about where the world is headed. These conversations matter more than ever right now. And if you want more honest, deeply researched stories like this, make sure you're subscribed to the True Archive. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.